The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hey, Brooke, I noticed you're on the line. Can you hear me okay?
I oh there. I can. Yep.
Okay,
It sounds
very
good.
good. Good, good. Well, thank you again for agreeing to add some input into this evening session. Should you want to do that, feel welcome at any time, okay?
Fantastic. Sounds good. I will do my best. I am hotspotting my phone sitting in my car at
Okay.
the ball field because I had to get my kid to a basketball game. So
Okay, yeah, it's that time
if I
of year,
drop off,
isn't
it's
it?
because my hotspot it is. And if I drop off, it's because my hotspot is being ornery and not wanting to collect to
Yeah,
do what I need it to do right now.
I totally understand that. We
Oh,
used
the
to
things we
I know, right? We used to use a hotspot for our internet too, and it would get so anxious about doing these webinars from the hotspot because I was never sure how long it was going to cooperate.
Yeah, and it usually does really well, but for the last couple of days it's been ornery, and I think it's because my kids are using it more than they're supposed to be using.
Sure.
So I'm like, oh, Lord, it's like of all days.
Of course, of course. So what I will do, why don't we do this, Brooke? As I'm talking, why don't I go ahead at certain points and just invite you to share any additional thoughts? That way you won't have to worry about trying to, get in or trying to unmute yourself. I will just invite you to speak. Of course, if you hear something where you just feel like you have to offer insight, I'll certainly just unmute yourself and speak up. Otherwise, I'll just intentionally and consciously try to bring you in throughout the webinar. Does that sound like a good plan?
Okay, that sounds good.
Okay.
That
Okay.
sounds like a plan.
Good. For now, I'll go ahead. I'm going to mute myself and I'll go ahead. I think I can mute you too. And we'll just wait for the others. It looks like we have about 26 registered, which is a very good number. So we'll see how many actually end up participating.
Yeah, and well, I was curious to see how many are actually school leaders and how many are school board members,
Right.
because this is a crazy time of year for school
I
leaders. So I'm curious
know. Yeah,
how many are able to tag in tonight.
right, right.
But
Hopefully,
it's a good time for board members because just before, moving into the summer season and kind of some food for
sure.
thought
Yeah.
for upcoming year.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So,
So we'll see. I'll try to kind of assess that accordingly myself as well. So hopefully, just by seeing the names as they enter the webinar, we'll be able to identify that. Looks like your boss just joined us too, so I will say hello
Chris
to
is on
him.
too.
Yeah, looks
Well,
like
and I was just flipping through and kind of looked through this, and one of the things that keeps coming up in my mind is all of these things you're talking about are all evidences for their evaluations.
yeah,
Because
right,
all those evaluation tools have to provide evidences. So when they're
right,
doing these monthly reports, these are all performance indicators. These are all evidences that can be going towards those evaluation tools.
right.
Now, the
Yeah,
big question, me and Chris and I have been having this conversation, is I don't think many of our charter schools are using one of those four tools.
yeah, probably not. Yeah, probably not.
So our push is to try to get them to be aware that they have to pick one of those four tools,
Right,
or their own, but provide the research for it. And so
right.
that may be one of the pieces I add,
Good.
because I will be sending out an email that states the state law
Yep.
and the things that if you so choose to use your own, you can, but you have to have the research to back it, which none
Right.
of them do.
Right. Right. Exactly. Yeah, that's a very good point. That would be great insight. So we'll make sure you have an opportunity to speak to that.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay, very good, my dear. Well, I'm going to go ahead. I think I can mute you from here. So I will do that. I'll unmute Chris and say hello to him.
Sounds great. Thanks.
Hey, Chris, welcome. Can you hear me?
Hey Angie, can you hear me?
I sure can. How are you?
Oh, I'm very good, thanks. I'm just getting done traveling and just kind of getting into the hotel room here.
Good.
I did tell Brooke, um, and I don't know if she passed this on, but I have a class I have to be at or on line at 7:30.
Okay,
So
sure.
if I step away,
Yeah,
my apologies, but it's just a group project. I'm taking a class through CMU Global, so
no worries.
just kind of working on that.
Yeah. And
So.
actually, I kind of ran through this one as a practice webinar earlier, and I'm not sure this one is going to run the full hour anyway. I mean, it'll be close, but it might just be a
Okay.
little shy of the full 60 minutes. So that might work out very well for you.
Okay. And if I don't talk to you, the next couple weeks are absolutely crazy for me. But
Sure.
Jenny and I had some good conversations today about doing some webinars next year. I think you and I talked about it, about the
Right.
ESPs and maybe
Yeah.
evaluations.
Yeah.
So if you can be thinking, I'd like to offer 3 next year.
Yep.
If we could have that theme of ESP, I think that would go over well. And just talking to our field reps, I think that's an area where, our boards could really benefit. So,
Perfect. Yep. Sounds great. Sounds great.
okay.
All right, my friend. Well, I will go
All
ahead
right.
and mute you. We'll wait for others to join. It looks like they're filtering in. So hopefully we can get started right at 6:30.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Oh, he's self-muted. Peter, good evening. I see you have your hand raised. Do you have a question, or was that an accidental bump of the button? Peter, can you hear me? Hmm. Well, good evening, everyone. I promised LSSU we would get started right at 6:30, so I'm going to go ahead and fulfill that promise, even though we have several others expected to be joining us. I think we had a large registration for this webinar, about 26 people, and we have about 7 on the webinar right now. So I'm expecting an onslaught of joiners at any moment. But in the meantime, I certainly want to welcome all of you. And I just want to say to you, I think we're even more appreciative of the participation in this particular webinar, because we certainly recognize the timing isn't as great as it could be, certainly with respect to school leadership participating, knowing this is a busy time of end of the year activities. So again, I know I very much appreciate your participation, particularly in this session, given the timing, and I know LSU does as well. So again, welcome. Couple of housekeeping topics I just want to share, as I have during past webinars. This webinar, like the ones prior to it, is being recorded, and it will appear on LSSU's site with a relatively quick turnaround, hopefully within the next week or even sooner. So you can access the webinar just as the others for future reference and future conversation. And let me say to you, this one might be of particular interest for future reviewing, simply because it does speak directly to that school leadership board relationship. And I'm not sure how many school leaders are participating this evening. So those of you that have school leaders that aren't participating might find this one particularly useful as you're continuing to cultivate that relationship. So feel free to access that along with the others on LSSU site. Throughout the webinar, should you have any questions, comments, insights that you'd like to share, those of you that have been participating are familiar with the multiple ways that you're able to do that. Those of you that might be joining us for the first time, you should see a chat window, you should see a questions window or pane on your screen, and you can also use your hand icon. And I try to monitor all of those ways of asking questions or sharing comments throughout the webinar. So if I don't respond right away, please know that it's not because I'm ignoring you, that I might be in the throes of a thought, and I'm at that age where if I don't finish my thought, I might lose it. So just please be patient. Know that I'll get to your questions and comments as soon as I finish my thought. So just quickly want to review with you the prior 4 webinars, just as a reminder of, again, how we arrived at this evening. Incidentally, I will share this is the 5th and final webinar of this series for the 2017-2018 academic year. And let me also just thank you, all of you, for being such engaged participants and for your follow-up comments and follow-up questions and follow-up interest relative to the topics that we've covered. And I hope that even though this is the last webinar in this series, that we'll be webinaring together in the future. And I think we will. We're in the process, LSSU and I, of discussing, based on your feedback, some of your feedback, what might be of most value for you for next year. So hopefully we'll all be rejoined during the 2018-2019 year through this webinar professional development format. But as you recall, just quickly, we started this series discussing the proverbial 3-legged stool, where we talked about the role of the authorizer, the board, and management. So those 3 very critical players or stakeholders in this work, and how those roles really align in parallel based on the responsibilities that each of those stakeholders share. So we spent time talking about that, and then from there talked about effective communication. And remember, as you recall, again, we defined effective communication as sharing with the right people the right information at the right time. Our 3rd session was about building an effective board team and how to continue that effectiveness through the role of the officer. And then finally, becoming a leadership board. That was the last session a couple of months ago that we engaged in. And now tonight, a little bit different, because tonight's session is really addressing, again, that school leadership and board relationship. So aptly entitled Managing Your Board, the what, when, why, and how of effective board management. So while it's really critical for boards to be engaged in this webinar, this one was really geared towards school leadership. So hopefully we have school leaders on the line that can, again, add some insight and hear this conversation. And then, as I said earlier, for those board members that are participating and do not have school leadership on the line, just remembering to perhaps share some of the elements of this webinar with them at a future date. So without further ado, as they say, we will go ahead and move through these webinar slides. So managing your board, the what, when, why, and how of effective board management. Let me just clarify and define what I mean by managing your board. That phrase, the word managing, in the context of this webinar, is not intended to be an authoritative kind of management or a power kind of management. What I mean from the school leadership perspective by managing your board is really helping your board, right? Helping your board become an effective, efficient, and professional leadership board. So throughout this webinar this evening, we're going to talk about how the school leader can help facilitate that, right? Can help facilitate making its board look very good at the board table during those board meetings. So just wanted to clarify that that's really where I'm coming from managing. It's helping your board be the kind of effective board that it wants to be, that it aspires to be. So before we get started, let's just talk about what I mean then by effective board management in terms of this session and what it starts with, right? So effective board management starts with right here, communication, 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 right? And it's a little bit like real estate, right? When we talk about real estate, location, 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 only this is communication, 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 which shouldn't surprise those of you that have participated in my webinars in the past, because as you know, communication is really key to a lot of my relational conversations with respect to your role as a governing body. So it does start with communication, and again, communication in the context of the leadership board relationship. So you're going to hear some different types of communication ingredients than those that we talked about, for example, during our effective communication webinar, where, as I just indicated to you, we talked about sharing with the right people the right information at the right time. That is still very important relative to the board's role. Those are still critical ingredients to effective communication with the board among its board colleagues and between board and management or board and leadership relative to what we shared during that webinar. This particular webinar, however, is going to address, just as the subtitle suggests, the what, whens, whys, and hows of effective board management. So again, just wanted to make that clear. So before we get started, again, I keep saying that, right? It's like the checks in the mail. But before we get started, you know, I love this visual. I think it's an important reminder for all of these webinars of what it is the board should always be focused on, right? And in the context of this conversation, it really does apply as well, because what we're going to be talking about here is how school leadership can really facilitate those effective conversations, those effective exchanges with its board relative to the inputs and outputs that ultimately get the board in a position to make those outcomes-based decisions, right? And as you'll remember, as you'll recall, those outcomes-based decisions, those outcomes are about the impacts changes based on the effectiveness of the inputs and the outputs. So again, I think a critical, quick conversation to have with respect to this session this evening, because school leadership certainly has a role to play in the inputs and outputs conversation, and certainly has a critical role to play in ensuring that those are leading to outcomes-based conversations and decisions with respect to the board's role. So again, I think worth showing. Let me also share with you, before we get too deeply into the discussion this evening, when I talk about school leadership engaging in this productive conversation, productive dialogue, productive communication with the board, I don't really care what structurally is going on at the school, right? So what do I mean by that? Whether the school leadership is employed by management or whether the school leadership is employed directly by the board, in the context of this conversation doesn't really matter, because regardless, from my perspective, school leadership still has a very critical role to play in ensuring the board is well informed. And so I think that role could be used a little bit differently in some structural situations than it has been. But I think from the board's perspective and from school leadership's perspective, you really need to think about, particularly if there's a management company involved, how the school leadership can play that facilitator role as we work through some of this discussion this evening. So again, just something else I wanted to make clear as we move forward this evening. So what we're going to talk about is what, when, why, and how, right? What should I be sharing with the board from a school leadership perspective? When or how often would my board like me to share it, or should I be sharing it? Why is it important that we share information, and how would my board like me to share or communicate with it? So that's really going to be the basis for the remainder of our webinar this evening. We're going to take each one of those elements and have deeper discussion about them. So of course, we're going to start with the what, and we're going to talk about the information under the what that should be shared is being data that educate and inform on those three components you see before you: teaching and learning, funding and financial position, and operations or operational effectiveness. So again, we're going to break each of those down a little bit further as we advance our discussion this evening. So when we talk about teaching and learning, I want to really break it up into two components. You've got student achievement data. So this is the data that you likely see on some kind of frequency. Student growth and proficiency, we oftentimes refer to that as student achievement and growth, right, is really probably being seen a couple, 2-3 times a year, because that really is a result of either any nationally norm reference tests that might be administered at the school, or the state tests like the MSTEP. So that's going to be your student achievement and growth data. But in addition, you also might want to see cohort data, right? So in charter schools world, for a period of time, and even today, I think it's important, particularly for newer schools, that you're looking at cohort data, for example, that demonstrates how well the students who have been with you the longest are doing. How well are you educating the students that have been with you for a certain period of time? Oftentimes that period of time is 3 years. That's an example of cohort data, because what you want to be able to demonstrate is that the students that have been with you the longest are showing the most proficiency or the most achievement and the most growth, right? So that's the cohort data we're talking about. So, and certainly school leadership has a critical contributing role to play in that conversation. Subgroup data, right? So these are all these are all your subgroups. So taking a look at your special education population, for example, taking a look at your, maybe your African American students. These are just examples, right? Taking a look at your Arab American students. So what's that? Your females, your males. So what are those subgroups looking like in terms of student achievement? That college prep data and information. So again, if you're high school in particular, you want to see what that college entrance data look like, right? So what is happening with ACT preparation, and what's happening with ACT results, and how are those outcomes faring relative to national standards, and faring relative to what universities require what numbers in terms of entry and admission and access. So college preparation data, mission specific data. This is the information you want to look at on some regular basis. So how well are we working toward achieving our mission, right? So if your mission is to, let's just say simply to experience academic growth tenfold within your student population, if that's part of your mission, then you want to be looking at that data on some sort of frequency. Subject data, how are we doing in math, English, science, social studies, and then certainly that at-risk program data. So I'm sure most of you are seeing that data on some kind of regular basis. And again, I would hope that school leadership is lending support both verbally and through documentation to that student achievement data. But we all know that some of that data, some of the student achievement data, as I just indicated, is not going to come on a regular basis due to timing, right? Due to testing timing, for example. So what else could you be looking at relative to teaching and learning that gives the board some sense of comfort and confidence that when it does come time for testing, you're going to see perhaps positive outcomes, right? So we're going to call those our key performance indicator data. So what are those data? Climate and culture, student mobility attrition, teacher mobility attrition, facility safety and security. Just an example of what you could be looking at as a board from school leadership on a more regular basis. Again, that is an indicator potentially of how well some of these assessment outcomes in some of these groups, divided, your cohorts, your subgroups, might perform on those statewide and NWEA map tests, for example. So that really is sort of, that what, generally speaking, of teaching and learning. And you'll see the note on the bottom that if the board has any kind of strategic plan in place, then it is incumbent upon school leadership to report details relative to progress toward achieving those strategic goals and objectives. So let me just share with you briefly, for example, I work with schools on strategic planning, and essentially what happens then at every board meeting is school leadership is sharing a report that I will typically help school leadership prepare that speaks to all of those strategic goals and objectives that have been identified by the board. So each month there's some kind of reporting happening relative to progress toward that strategic plan. So I wanted to just note that to make it clear that this is not, well, certainly this isn't all inclusive, right? There might be other areas that your school leadership is reporting on or management is reporting on. These are just some of the key areas that I wanted to touch on, particularly those KPI or key performance indicator data. So I'm gonna stop right now and give you an opportunity to ask questions, but I'm also going to ask LSSU. Brooke is on the line as well as Chris Oshelski. So Brooke, as some of you might know, has a school leadership background. So I want her to just maybe add anything that she might have seen or any insights she can offer relative to this slide that might be helpful. So Brooke, if there's anything that you'd like to add here, feel free to do that.
Thanks, Angie. I think one of the things that I took away from when you're talking about the college prep and college prep data, and I think sometimes our school, we need to keep in mind too that just because we might be a K-8 building, it doesn't mean that we can't look at PSAT data or we can't look at those correlation data points from the NWEA scores. They give us the projection of if they're on target or not. And so there are those documents out through NWEA that show us, if we're expecting them to get a 22, say their goal score is a 22, this is where our students should be performing at each particular grade level on the NWEA. And so we can look ahead to that college prep data and information even as low as like third grade. So kind of keeping that in the back of our mind, those are some other data points we could talk about. One of the other things I used to always give my my board on a monthly basis was either my progress towards my own personal goals, and that was tied to those student data and those key performance indicators, as well as those school improvement goals. And that kind of school improvement goals generally fall underneath the student achievement data,
right? And
sometimes depending on what your goal is, that climate and culture piece. A lot of times I pulled in a lot of my PBIS data and my referral information, kind of just as some examples of some of that information you could be looking for and seeing regarding that climate and culture. Are our referrals going down? What are our what's our target times? Right. Here's some of the notes, or here's some of the updates where we've been doing PBIS meetings and some of that data analysis that's happening in those meetings too. So
good. Good. Thank you, Brooke. That's helpful. And thank you for the clarification on the college prep data, because that's absolutely true. I often tell schools that they really need to be working with the kids and talking about college at kindergarten, right? Because it's never too soon to start thinking about that and talking about it. And then certainly using that data to help identify that trajectory for later. So yes, thank you for that clarification. Thanks, Brooke, very much.
No problem. Thank you.
And then, so moving on then from teaching and learning to funding and financial positions. So oftentimes we talk about financial statements and financial packets, right? And that the board should receive those at every board meeting and take action as appropriate and or approve or accept the financial packets as appropriate. So we know generally what should be expected in that financial packet for the board to make those wise, informed financial decisions. But what about funding, and what kinds of conversations are we having around funding, right? Because that's certainly part of the financial position, the financial health of the school, what money is coming in and how are we using that to support our programs and our strategies, which is one of the bullets under funding. So I'm sure we're talking about fund balance, but what about grants and title monies? Are we having conversation about what those grant dollars are looking like, what those grant dollars are being used for? What grant monies are out there, are grant opportunities? Should we pursue them? And if you're having discussion about them, are those opportunities aligned with our mission, right? And what we're trying to accomplish at the school. And again, are we funding those key programs and key strategies? And what does that instructional support look like in terms of those percentages? So we often talk about it relative to instructional versus administrative or operational support. So that's another piece of the financial conversation that I think is important, but not always shared. So again, just refocusing our conversation tonight on the school leadership's role relative to that communication. These are very key areas that school leadership could be discussing with the board, right? So just ensuring that those conversations are happening. And I think particularly the third one, when you're really thinking about, okay, what are our key programs here? What are our key strategies? Having conversation about those and then ensuring that there's financial support for them. So just understanding what those are and then budgeting enough dollars and cents to fund them, to help support them, is key to that conversation. So again, that's sort of the funding and financial position of the what. And then the operations or the operational effectiveness. So this really does get to that inputs and outputs conversation, right? But not from the perspective of just sharing, okay, this is how many staff members we have, and this is what's happening with the facility, and oh, our food's really good, because those are the kinds of operations that we're referring to here. We think about staffing, think about facilities, think about the educational program, think about technology, food service, all those operational things that happen on a day-to-day basis that cause the school to keep running, right? To keep advancing, to keep moving forward. So having conversation about those, again, relative to outcomes, but relying on your school leadership to report on those, I think is really key. So we talked about staffing a little bit under the key performance indicator, just showing that that's one, for example, of those key performance indicators. That's also sort of an operations kind of discussion, right? So what you want to know is, what does your staff look like? What's staff attrition looking like? And right now, I'm sure you're having the conversation with school leadership, if you haven't already, about what's staff looking like for next year, right? What kind of stability will there be in staffing? So remember that all translates into potentially those student outcomes. And then facilities, conversation around facilities, educational program, right? So what does the educational program look like relative to the curriculum, relative to teaching and learning, relative to student outcomes, right? So that's what I'm talking about with the educational program relative to operational effectiveness. And then staffing too. So one of the schools that I work with in Lansing, they're going to be undergoing reauthorization, charter contract reauthorization next year. And they're thinking about adding a component to their educational program. And I'm telling them that's great, but you really need to decide what the educational program is going to look like, use reauthorization and the rebuilding of the charter contract to modify that educational program, and then be sure that you've got staff on board that can facilitate teaching to that educational program. So project-based learning, for example, right? We've all heard it. Not many schools do it with fidelity as it was intended. I'll just share that with you. It takes special skills for a teacher to teach under a project-based learning format, for example. So you want to be sure, again, as you look at those inputs and those outputs, that those kinds of conversations are taking place, because you don't want, some whimsical school leader to say, hey, tomorrow we're going to implement a project-based learning program, and then find out you have no teachers to support it, right? So that's where the inputs and outputs conversation can become really critical and effective from an outcomes perspective, which is what the board's interested in. Technology, as you look at the future of testing, as you look at the future of teaching and learning, do you have the technology that supports that, right? What's your bandwidth? Do you have enough bandwidth, for example, to accommodate a larger facility or the number of students that you have? So again, those are inputs, outputs, conversations relative to operations that I think can be really critical for the board and school leadership to engage in. Food service is another one of those operations, kind of those day-to-day functions that you want to maybe have some conversation about with the school leader on occasion. And I'll also share with you a lot of the operations expectations are outlined or defined through whatever formal agreement you have with either management and or school leadership. So if you have a management agreement, in it there should be some performance, maybe not performance expectations, that's another conversation for another day, but in that agreement, it should outline what you can expect of school leadership relative to those inputs and outputs, operationally speaking, whether it's, again, a management situation and or a direct employment between the school board and the school leader. But there should be some agreement in place that helps define what those operational expectations are with respect to that relationship. So again, I'll be quiet for a minute. That really completes kind of the what, those three components, the teaching and learning, the funding and finances, and the operations or operational effectiveness. So I'll just, invite questions. I'm looking at questions. I'm looking for hands. I'm looking for any chats in the chat pane. I know I know that it's a little challenging sometimes to use the webinar to share thoughts, but I'll give you a minute. Actually, Chris, I invited Brooke to speak. Chris, on behalf of LSSU, is there anything you would like to add to this portion of the discussion?
Angie, nothing, directly about this particular webinar, but I did want to share with everyone that is on the webinar that LSSU, again, we want to, as an authorizer, support our academies in any way that we can, especially the board. Obviously, our contract is with the board, and any types of trainings or any other types of professional development that they are interested in, to please make sure to contact us. We can provide additional webinars. We can provide people on site to help with any types of situations or training that they are interested in.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Great. So again, that completes the what portion of the discussion. Now we're going to move to the when conversation. So remember, when should I, as a school leader, be sharing information with my board? And that's pretty easy question to answer. I'd say to you that should be mutually determined between the board and the school leader. However, as you're thinking about when or how often, I'm going to share with you some considerations to maybe discuss and to share. And let me just say to you, because this webinar is so content heavy, I added some animation just to spice it up a little bit. So you're going to see some bullets flying in and flying out, and hopefully that will provide just a level of entertainment that we haven't experienced prior to tonight. So as we look at considerations, the first thought is just to ensure from a school leadership perspective that your board understands, that you board understand that you're not going to likely receive expressed academic achievement growth in data at every board meeting. However, as we just talked about a few slides ago in the what, student achievement can and should be addressed at every board meeting, and it can and should be addressed through those key performance indicators, right? That's sort of the gap filler between those outcomes proper and what the board can expect based on those key performance indicators. So I gave you an example of some of those, what we call KPIs, right, in the slide. But again, I would encourage some dialogue on what else or what additional might be helpful from you know, a student outcome, student achievement perspective. Whoops, I bumped that. And then, of course, you will be sharing from a school leadership perspective financial information at every board meeting. And then I would encourage you, as you're talking about financial information, as you're reviewing those financials, as you're looking through your board packet, to really talk about what kinds of funding conversations we need to have at the board table as well, and use the school leadership to help inform that, because again, those funding considerations really directly impact school leadership. The school leadership certainly has a role to play in that. And then consider, you know, again, compliance-related materials. How often do we want to be talking about compliance-related materials? So really touching on those kind of key areas, the academics, the finances, and compliance as well. But additional considerations as you look at the when is use your master calendar, right, of reporting requirements to guide the timing and the discussions. I don't know from a board perspective or from a school leadership perspective, if you think of your master calendar as a tool to have timed discussions relative to what's coming due or what's coming up, but use it for that, because there's a whole lot of stuff on that calendar that's required of you. Use that to your advantage by engaging in discussion in advance about application and enrollment, right? About obviously the budget, about quarterly financial statements. So really use that calendar to help guide those discussions accordingly. And I apologize, I was just reading a question that I'll get to when I get done with this page. So Again, using your master calendar for that. And be sure, as an additional consideration, that you're identifying what the timing expectations are for those board packets. And again, I know oftentimes the board packets are really compiled by management, but that's not to say that, again, your school leader can't be instrumental in ensuring that you're getting these board packets in a timely manner or in a time that is expected by the board, right? So do we want our information 1 week in advance, 2 weeks in advance? And again, use school leadership to help facilitate that. Reach a mutual understanding on last minute communication, should those be necessary. As certain issues, right, because oftentimes this is issues, as certain issues surface at the last minute, what kind of communication board from school leadership would you like me to share, and how would you like me to share it, right? Do you want it by email? Do you want me to, if it's close to the board meeting or the day of, do you want me to just wait and bring it to the board meeting? Do you want me to include some kind of statement in your board packet if it's last minute relative to sending out the information? So again, reach a mutual understanding of what that will look like, how the board wants it, and how school leadership can facilitate that. And then finally, from a school leadership perspective, don't forget to share with your board any upcoming events, vacations, conferences, anything that you're doing that might impede any of those timing expectations. And then certainly make those necessary adjustments in advance. So again, be sure you're communicating that. So that's really all from the when perspective. So let me just, I'm going to stop right there because this is an academic achievement question that reads, as far as academic achievement, besides the MSTEP and the NWEA test, what are some other examples of tracking academic performance of the school? Those are certainly the key pieces of tracking performance. Matt, I hope you don't mind if I use your name. Those are the key pieces, but certainly there are other ways you could do that through those key performance indicators. Like I said, that's not necessarily direct tracking of academic performance, but it is, as I mentioned, hopefully indicators that give the board some level of comfort, again, of what those testing outcomes might look like or be like. But in terms of, what goes on in the classroom, without getting into a big, long discussion, we talk about formative assessment and summative assessment. The tests, the MSTEPs, the NWEAs, those are what we refer to as summative assessments. Formative assessments are really what happen in the classroom. So if there's an interest from the board in knowing, for example, what is happening at a formative level. So formative assessments could be something as simple as, the students putting together portfolios at the end of the lesson plans that speak to the lesson. Could be if there's a kind of a standard testing arrangement in the classroom on any topic or any discussion or any oral presentations, what might those be looking like? So those are more key performance indicators, those sort of formative assessment components, but still might help track some of that academic achievement relative to what we'll call, the major tests. And I know some schools do, well, certainly at like Brooke had mentioned this, there's also the ACT prep test, the ACT, the PS, or I keep saying ACT, it's SAT now, SAT, PSAT, some of those prep tests that also speak to academic achievement. So I hope that answers your question, Matt, gives you a little sense of what that might look like. So we're going to go on now to the why. Why is it even important that we share information? I came across this recently, and I don't think it's any surprise that there's school leadership or superintendent turnover. I think the tenure now is roughly about 3 years for a school leader or superintendent. But what I thought was interesting, particularly relative to this session and to the why, is this. According to the Education Writers Association, the major reason for turnover is attributed to a poor relationship with the school board. So that is sort of the overarching why of all of this, right? You want to ensure leadership stability of good leaders, right? I mean, if you have not so great leaders, you need to talk about that as well. But you don't want to be a revolving door when it comes to school leadership, because there's a whole lot of reasons. School leadership, good quality school leadership stability is important within the school walls. So it's important that there's stability. If stability is suggestive of the relationship between the school leader and the school board, then certainly this whole why section of this webinar is even more important, right? So again, cultivating that really great relationship, I think, between the school board and school leadership is really critical for a whole lot of reasons, particularly for this one. So why is it important from a school leadership perspective that I share information? There are expectations of the board. So if you want to help the board meet those expectations of acting in a timely, responsible manner, information sharing is critical, as I just suggest here. It's critical in ensuring that the board has what it needs to make those decisions, to make those well-informed, effective, timely, responsible decisions. Because face it, school leaders, hopefully we have a few on the line tonight, school leaders, when boards make timely decisions, it ultimately makes your job a whole lot easier, right? I mean, when you're waiting for boards to make decisions on things relative to school operations, or, you know, the day-to-day happenings at the school, or those large events or actions that are required of the board, it makes your life a little miserable. So you want to, again, help with that. You want to help them make those effective, timely, responsible decisions. And again, your board has critical decision-making responsibilities. It's the expectation that they will make those decisions based upon relevant and meaningful information that are being made in the spirit of advancing the mission of the Academy on behalf of the Academy, and it's most importantly, its students, right? Your board should always be in the know and never blindsided by unexpected data, information, and details. So this is another big why, right? Why is it important? So the board is never surprised. You never, ever, ever want to surprise your board with much of anything, but particularly student data, student achievement data, general information and details, right? And let me just share this with you. If you know, as a school leader or management, if you know, for example, that you're going to have, let's just say a parent attending a board meeting, maybe an unhappy parent or an unhappy group of parents attending a board meeting, you need to let your board know. I've been to board meetings where 40 parents have shown up and the board's been surprised. You do not want your board to be placed in that position, because number one, they're not sure why they're there. And number two, it's just an awkward, tense, precarious position for all of you to be in. So something as simple as letting the board know if a parent is going to be attending the meeting because he or she is unhappy, and then why, will go a long way, I think, in cultivating that meaningful relationship with your board. And then, certainly your board is the Academy's connection to the authorizer, right? So again, help your board look good with your authorizer. And by helping it look good is helping it be informed always. Informed enough that it can intelligibly speak to the authorizer about the status of the Academy over which it's governing or representing. And just one moment, I'm just going to open up my control panel. It looks like there might be another question. And this is a comment. I think it's from Brooke at LSSU regarding the response I just gave on academic achievement. And I'm sorry, Brooke, I should have unmuted you so you could speak to this. But she says she would also add common local assessment data, third grade reading data, number of IRRPs in the district, school improvement goal data collection. She says she's also seen a focus on a subject or teacher presentation at the board meeting and allowed the board to hear from people about the data from more than just a school leader. She says she likes this because it shows the data conversation are happening throughout the district, not just in the central administrative office. So thank you. And that's in response to the question I just answered regarding that achievement data that Matt asked. So thank you, Brooke. That's really helpful insights, helpful feedback. So thank you for that. And I would also, under the why category, be sure that you're taking advantage of those teachable board moments, school leaders. So I use Charlton Heston as an example here. So if the board's asking questions of school leadership about, well, why aren't we seeing academic achievement and growth data on a more regular basis, be sure to use that as an opportunity to remind them what kind of tests you administer, when you administer them, maybe use that as an opportunity to share why that's important, why these assessments are important in measuring growth and achievement, and then speak to, even go on and speak to where your students are at currently as you're having the conversation. So again, sharing information through those teachable moments, I think, is also important and a good why component. And then simply transparency, integrity, and common understanding encourages a healthy board-school leadership relationship. So another big why of all of that. So finally, the last component is how. How would my board like me to communicate with it? Again, conversation, right? What determined with your board how it likes to best communicate, either email, telephone, written correspondence. And if you've been doing something a certain way, re-engage the conversation and just ask the board, is this still the best way that you like me to communicate with you? Do you still prefer email, or would you like to change that? Would you like a different means of communication? And then, identify together any kind of presentation formats, right? I use the example here. If you prepare a written administrator's report pursuant to the board's desires, do not reread the report in the public board meeting. Instead, summarize the content and elicit questions. I would also suggest to you, if you do an administrator's report and if you don't send it along in the board meeting packet, I would certainly encourage you to do that and allow the board to review the administrator's report and then come to the meeting with questions. So you're not just standing up there, reading content, but you're assuming based on what you know of your board or presuming that they've reviewed the materials and that they're coming with questions. And then quite simply, know your individual board members, right? Get to know them and what makes them tick, right? So again, I give a hint here. While you agree as a collective on how communication should happen, it still would behoove the school leader to understand the individual board member personalities, right? And just anticipate what the board member or board members might be thinking and or asking from you. I go to board meetings all the time, just as sort of a side note, where I listen to boards ask the same questions on what it wants over and over and over again. In each meeting, school leadership is writing down, yep, I'll get that for you. I'll get that for you. And I oftentimes find myself thinking, and I've shared this in situations, you know what they want by now. Why aren't you just sharing it with them, right? Why are you forcing the board to ask you every month for X, Y, and Z? You know what they want. You're anticipating, you should be anticipating that, and you should be prepared to provide that to them. So again, understand what makes your board members tick and then accommodate that. And then certainly, what's the role of the officers in communication, right? So what is it that the board president needs communicated to him or her? And then same conversation. How would he or she like me to communicate that information? And you could suggest that with all the roles, the treasurer, the vice president, the secretary, if there's certain specifics relative to what they should be receiving with respect to your school environment, how would they like you to communicate with them? And then committees, what's your role, your school leadership role with those board committees, and what's the communication expectation there? And then certainly where appropriate and necessary, don't forget about board policy, right? Always align your communications. If you have any board policies that speak to communications, particularly board in your board operations policies, if there's anything in those policies that speak to communication, be certain that your school leadership understands what that language is, and then again can accommodate that accordingly. And I always say present materials in simple visual formats through graphs and charts, and then explain or support with any follow-up information. So you've seen these graphs and charts before. These are the kinds of things I'm talking about, right? So when we look at climate and culture, for example, as a key performance indicator, you see some examples of what the reporting might look like relative to climate and culture, student enrollment, achievement and growth, just quick visuals that I as a board member can look at and say, oh yes, I see, our chronic absenteeism is 12%, relative to maybe 20 where it was last month, whatever that might look like. And then you can ask wise questions from the graphs and the visuals. And same thing with the financials, right? We've seen these before. So again, student enrollment comes into play with respect to finances and funding, the fund balance, and how are you breaking down, those key expenditures, right? So instructional, pupil support services. I can look at this pie chart and then I can look at the legend below it and see where the bulk of our money is going, right? Based on what this pie chart is suggesting. So another, just example of how to present information to the board in ways that they can quickly see where, what the status of certain issues or certain topics are, and then ask wise questions from that status. So summary, wow, I think this is the first time we actually finished on time. Actually, I told Chris we'd probably be done a little bit earlier than 7:30. So I guess I was right. We're like 2 minutes earlier than 7:30. But let me just summarize. Obviously, good, effective communication matters and is the key in forging a healthy working relationship between school leadership and board. An effectively managed board can make your jobs much easier as school leaders. It's never too late to evaluate communication and identify the what's, when's, why's, and how's, right? And then check in with your board periodically. How can I better communicate with you? And then a board that looks good makes you look good. Behind every effective board is an equally effective school leader, some would say. So that really completes our webinar for this evening. So I'm going to just, again, be quiet for a minute, and I will certainly invite any questions, any follow-up comments, any thoughts from any of you that need to be shared. Chris, I think you have to exit here shortly, but do you want to share any final thoughts before you leave the webinar? Can you hear me, Chris?
Oh,
I
thanks.
think I accidentally muted you myself.
Yeah, I can. No, I want to thank all the board members and the administrators that have been attending our webinars. We appreciate it. Just a reminder, they are on our website with some additional other opportunities for professional development. We have quite a variety, and we're trying to always add new things to our website. Also, if any boards have additional ideas, to reach out to our field reps. I know John, Melissa, Garnet, and Larry are always interested in hearing from the board how we can better support them, and in any other way, you know, even with students, administration, and the board. We're also, Brooke has been working, and Julie, to provide additional professional development next year, not only for the boards, but also staff and administrators. So we're always willing to listen to any opinions or extra thoughts that people can give to us, so how we can improve our oversight and support. So
Great. Thanks, Chris, very much. And I'll ask the same of Julie and Brooke if they want to share any final thoughts. So Julie, I think you had a question or comment as well. So I'm just going to let you speak it.
Okay, can you hear me? This is Julie Hopper.
Yep, sure can.
Oh, great. Hey, sorry I was a little late joining. I had some running to do today, but
that's okay.
Well, I want to thank you, first of all, Angie, for a really nice job.
Thank you.
And for the board members and school leaders. I guess my only advice to, you know, for you when you're presenting data, information to the boards is keep it simple.
Yeah.
That's really the rule. I think, you know, I have the honor of serving on a school board myself, and sometimes, you know, you get data that where your eyes are just kind of crossed, and it's hard to make sense of it. So I think just the simplest form you can is probably the best rule to follow. You know, just be concise and make sure it's really easy to understand. So,
yeah.
But that's about it.
Good.
Brooks worked really hard to put together this professional learning catalog, and we're really excited about that. So my hat's off to her, and I think it'll be easy for you as school leaders and board members to register for the different workshops and such that we're going to have. So
good.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks, Julie.
No problem.
Brooke, any final thoughts or questions or comments from you?
I think the only thing I have to add is that I, as a school leader, tended to over communicate. I would rather make sure that my board, nothing was a secret. I was an open book, because I never wanted to be accused of keeping secrets, or furthermore, I never wanted anything to be a surprise. I wanted to over communicate what possibly could be happening and just give them a couple different, hey, just in case this might happen, this might happen, and this might happen. The other thing I would say is that a lot of these things we've discussed in this PowerPoint are awesome indicators that your administrators will be giving you, or can be used as evidences for their administrative evaluations. And we've kind of got some documentation coming we'll be sending out to the schools that, you know, in 2016, effective 2016, school boards were to be using one of the 4 school or state approved two approved state approved administrator evaluations. And if they're not using one of those state approved evaluations, that they need to be providing research to support the tool that they are choosing to use. But what we're seeing is all of the tools that are approved by the state have a list of evidences for that effectiveness. So these pieces that they're giving you, the data and all of those data pieces and all of that communication that they're giving you, you should be seeing those tying to not only to the school goals, but to also to the administrator's goals of proving to you and providing evidence to you that they are being an effective administrator, and giving you an opportunity for a conversation of, if they're not meeting your expectations in that administrator role, what are some things, and on the board being able to communicate back to them, what are your expectations and what would you like to see more from them to help that administrator grow in that role as well. So I just think that the things that you're seeing every month should be giving you a gauge on, is this an effective administrator? And as an administrator, it should be giving you an opportunity to, for lack of a better term, show off that you are doing a really good job. And if you're not providing that information, then you as an administrator need to self-look at that and say, am I giving them what they need to provide a effective gauge of me as an administrator?
Good, great, thanks, great point, Brooke. I appreciate that. Finally, we have a comment too that is really great and really critical to share. I think it was one of your board colleagues on the session this evening submitted a good reminder from school leadership, and that is to not assume that your board knows all the education acronyms, and we know that there are a ton of them. So just understanding that they need to have a better feel for what those might be. So as we throw out, MSTEP, NWEA, all the thousands of acronyms out there, to just be sure that your board understands what you're talking about, speaking in that common language. So thank you, Christy, for that thought.
And I would just, Angie, just one quick piece there. One of the things that I've done as a school leader is, especially for onboarding new board members, created kind of a cheat sheet of the lingo and some of those common terms and acronyms that we use, so that they were, and kind of a description of what that regarded, so that when board members came on board, we were able to kind of give them a little bit of background as to what some of those pieces were.
Perfect. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. Yeah, good insight. So thank you again all for your participation. Have a wonderful summer, and I so look forward to rejoining you sometime next year. But in the meantime, certainly use me as a resource too, along with the LSSU team. If you have any questions that I can answer relative to any of the information that I've shared in any of the webinars, do not hesitate to email me, call me, my cell. It appears on my messages, my invitations for these. Communicate with me however you like to ask questions, share comments. Again, use me as a resource accordingly. So again, thank you all, and have a great summer.
Thanks, Angie.
Thank you.